In fact, following from one of the last things that Lee mentioned about the importance of government working to educate and to address this challenge, both within government and within Canada, is something that our next speaker can speak to. Mr. Peter Flegel is the Executive Director for the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat. So the Government of Canada, they created a anti-racism secretariat that is the cornerstone of the Building a Foundation for Change, which is Canada's anti-racism strategy. In addition to coordinating federal action and driving the overall strategy, he and his team are responsible for working with federal departments and agencies to identify and coordinate initiatives, identify gaps, and consider the impact of new and existing policies on how it affects people, and especially, as Talib just mentioned, Indigenous peoples, so the First Peoples of Canada. Peter has a distinguished career as a social entrepreneur, a fundraiser, a columnist, a community organizer, and a musician. He has a broad understanding of Canada, Canadian heritage, Canadian culture, and a history of leadership within government, NGOs, and philanthropic sectors, including in areas such as diversity and employment, human rights, anti-Black racism, Indigenous issues, homophobia and transphobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, the challenges that our youth are facing, as well as the unique issues surrounding culture and multiculturalism and identity here in Canada. Thank you for joining us, Peter.
Thank you very much for having me, and bonjour à tout le monde. Je suis vraiment ravi d'être avec vous. I'm joining you this morning and this afternoon, I should say, and this evening from Ottawa on the unceded and surrendered traditional land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I really want to thank the Foundation for Path Forward for the invitation to join you all for this really important discussion on transnational white supremacist terrorism. Really, I'm here today to reaffirm that the Government of Canada's Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat is really committed to stand by your side, listen to you, support you, and collaborate with you so we can all move forward towards eradicating the real threat of white supremacy in our country. And that includes having the courage and foresight to name the problem for what it is, as you have done, white supremacist terrorism. While I'm honored to be here today, like many speakers, I wish there wasn't a need for this conversation in the first place. Historically, Canada has been reputed to pose a low threat of domestic or international terrorism, and this is really due to the idea that our domestic and international intelligence sharing practices have resulted in preventative measures and actions and prosecution of individuals associated with terrorist organizations. But that view obviously does not account for serious concerns that have been raised about the racial profiling of Muslim and Arab people and other racialized folk and Indigenous peoples and religious minorities, and the consequences that it bears. And nor does it account for the alarm bells that rang as much by intelligence services, academics, or grassroots groups across the country, calling us to pay heed to the looming and very real threat of white supremacist radicalization, extremist agitation, terrorist threats, and violence in Canada. And concomitantly, researchers and reporters have been warning of the laundering or mainstreaming of white supremacist ideologies through the weaponizing of plausible deniability to express ideas designed to help unravel the basic rights and freedoms which historically marginalized communities and peoples have really won for themselves over the last century and beyond. This, of course, as many speakers have pointed out, has become particularly stark with the weaponizing of precarity and vulnerability tied to the COVID-19 pandemic. From the attack on a Muslim family in London, Ontario, to the rise of anti-Semitism and the increased acts of violence against members of Asian communities and physical assaults against Black Muslim women in Alberta since the start of the pandemic, the threat of oppression continues to loom over peoples and communities with lived experience of racism. And again, as many have pointed out this evening, the recent controversy surrounding the convoy in February across our nation serves as a stark reminder that Canada is not immune to the rhetoric or to its effects. It's only one recent example where overt displays and incidents of hate have been witnessed. And let me be clear, we're not confronting a series of isolated social ills or simply ill-intentioned individuals. Rather, we find ourselves wrestling against all-encompassing ecosystems of hate, entrenched in oppressive and violent principles of white supremacists. And we are witnessing an increase in the recruitment of people who are immersed in white supremacist ideals, and the risks of radicalization and adherence to white supremacist ideas that are magnified now more than ever before, as many have pointed out. And we must also acknowledge, as you have done, the transnational dimension of the problem, the dark money that is funneled to support white supremacist groups, often through the veneer of what would appear to be respectable channels. The capacity for white supremacist terror groups to strategize and operate transnationally, and the ubiquity of these groups operating on online platforms to spread hate, disinformation, and misinformation multilingually and across the globe. All these factors demonstrate the need for us all to work more effectively across geographic borders to combat the scourge of white nationalist terror groups and their ideologies, which has been said really to be a whole of society, if not a global problem. So that's one of the reasons that the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat is really proud to lead on the creation of a North American Partnership on Racial Equity and Inclusion, which was announced last November by Prime Minister Trudeau, President Biden, and President López Obrador of Mexico last November at the North American Leaders Summit. The purpose is to enhance collaboration among allies in combating systemic racism, discrimination, and hate, and to advance racial equity and inclusion across the continent. So, dear friends, today's gathering presents us all with an opportunity to come together and commit once again to confronting this growing tide of hate and reject the false narratives that are driving this movement. It is only through working with Indigenous peoples, as well as racialized and religious minority communities and other equity groups, that we can and will stand firmly for justice. And there are efforts and initiatives at the federal government that I'd like to share with you briefly in the next few minutes. And I'd like to begin by sharing a bit about the work of the Secretariat, which is acting and operating as a hub, a convener, and a catalyst within the government of Canada, with a mandate to lead a whole of government approach to addressing racism, discrimination, and hate. Since 2019, we've convened thousands of Indigenous, Black, Asian, Arab, Latinx, Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, and several other racialized and religious minority leaders across the country within sectors of civil society. We've done this to engage and center the voices of communities and peoples with lived experience of hate, racism, and discrimination. These engagements have taken place through a variety of events, including the National Summit on Anti-Semitism and the National Summit on Islamophobia, which we organized. Over 400 recommendations from community have been gathered through these engagements. And as I speak, my team is using the information to inform preparations for the renewal of Canada's anti-racism strategy. And we're really looking forward to engaging directly with many of you here this evening in building the new National Action Plan on Combating Hate, which has been mentioned in the mandate letter the Honorable Minister Ahmed Hussein, Minister of Housing and Diversity and Inclusion. So we've heard from community and political leaders, academics, activists, and members with intersectional identities that we have a long and arduous struggle ahead of us against whether it's anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Black, anti-Asian, anti-Arab racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and all other forms of hate. That is why it is really important for us to work collaboratively with you to see the government take all the necessary measures to put an end to hate in Canada once and for all. So we acknowledge, as has been emphasized today, that there's still so much work to be done, but want to reiterate that the Federal Secretariat and Government of Canada's commitment to working together with community partners like you to address the real threat of transnational terrorism, white supremacist terrorism in Canada. Together, we must be vigilant in the fight against white supremacist radicalization and work alongside one another to prevent the growing tide of hate from dominating our nation. The Government of Canada will diligently continue to explore ways to better serve the needs of diverse communities and peoples across the country. And so we stand with you and are fully committed to work together with you to build a better, safer, and consciously more inclusive Canada. Nous nous tenons à être à vos côtés et nous nous engageons pleinement à travailler avec vous pour construire un Canada plus sécuritaire et consciemment plus inclusif. So thank you very much, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue.